Hi everybody, my name is Hannah and this is Pepper and Pine, and today I want to share with you the main lesson books that my kids made when doing the 3rd grade Waldorf curriculum by Live Education. Now this video is part of a series of videos. I have another one that shows this curriculum in detail, and if you'd like to see that, you can find the link down in the description box below. There's also an entire playlist for the 3rd grade. Other videos will include the books and the resources that complement this curriculum, a video on the handwork projects for the 3rd grade, as well as the supplies you'll need for the 3rd grade. Alright, so I'm going to show you really quickly the 6 books that come in the Waldorf 3rd grade curriculum by Live Education. You can see to begin with that they're quite small and you get 6 books. Now these books are the resource for the teacher in order to put together the lessons. It's sort of like a handbook for the teacher to create the lessons. This is not for the student to work through or to read on his or her own. So for 3rd grade you get time, weight, measure, and money. This will be the math main lesson block, and it goes over linear measurement, it goes over time and money, and then it continues with the 4 basic math operations that were introduced in 1st grade, so it's just a continuation of those basic math skills. So this will be a main lesson block, but it will also include work that the student should be doing on a daily basis throughout the year. Humanity on Earth, Shelter, Clothing, and Farming. This is another main lesson block that will take quite some time in order to cover if you decide to do a lot of the hands-on projects. I don't have a main lesson book for this particular main lesson block since a lot of the projects we did were hands-on and I did not have my students do main lesson books for this one. Hebrew Myths and Culture, Prophets and Kings. We have a main lesson book on this main lesson block, but it's a little bit different because we didn't follow the curriculum. There's 2 main lesson blocks on Hebrew Myths and Culture. This one's going to go over all of the lessons. This one's going to include more lessons as well as form drawing and the celebrations and festivals and recipes that can complement the curriculum. So we chose our own resources for these 2 main lesson blocks, and I'll show you the main lesson books that we made. Myths and Culture, Akkad and Sumer. This one's really a beautiful main lesson block to do because it includes a lot of watercolors, and so we did that as well, and I'll show you that main lesson book. And then Literature, Grammar, Spelling, and Word Families. This main lesson block actually can go for multiple weeks, and it can run parallel to the main lesson block of the day because these lessons are really short, not to exceed maybe 20 minutes a day, and a main lesson block is usually about up to an hour and a half to 2 hours depending on what content you're covering and the age of the child. And so these lessons can run parallel to those main lesson blocks, and they can also pretty much cover the entire year. And so I do have some main lesson books to show you for this one. Alright, so let's start with the main lesson books for literature, grammar, and spelling. One thing is that this book will encourage you to use sentences and examples that will coordinate with the main lesson block of the day. And so though there will be a number of lists like spelling words and spelling lists, and then when it moves into grammar there'll also be some sentence examples. It works really well if you can coordinate that with the main lesson of the day. Alright, so the main lesson books that we have are from my second son, and it's over the course of 2 years. So this is a little bit of 3rd grade, a little bit of 4th grade, and actually a little bit of 5th grade. And so the grammar is going to span a couple of years, and I'll try to point out where it's 3rd grade level and where it's not. So I believe this one was more of the 2nd, 3rd, 4th grade level, and my son did a lot of watercolor pencils for this, so he just kind of drew it with the watercolor pencils, and then some places he just left them without adding water, and other places he did. So it's just that the artwork kind of coordinates with the dictation or the narration for that lesson. So these first lessons are the grammar lessons that you'll find in this main lesson book. And the very first lessons are the introduction of nouns and verbs. And the verbs are written in red because they are vibrant and action and movement in general, and the blue is for the nouns because in general the nouns are the things that you're going to see. They are more sedentary, and I really like the way that the colors are brought into the grammar lesson. Okay, so my son then has a narration here. It says, "What am I? Our home is a hive. Bee. I am bigger than a bee. Bird. My wings are feathered. Bird. I find the nectar and then make the honey. Bee." So I can't remember if this was out of the main lesson book or he made this up, and here's the drawing that coordinates with it. And then you can see the grammar that goes along with that previous lesson. So birds soar. You can see that soar is in red because it is a verb. And then birds flutter. And again, red for all the verbs. He forgot to put red in that one. Oh no! Like 8 years later. Hummingbirds flit about and hover. Seagulls glide. Hawks swoop. Ducks flap wings and hide. So you can see that you've got your verbs in red, and here you've got basically a complete sentence with just a noun and a verb. And I also have him writing it on a line with the initial structure for sentence diagramming, which isn't in the main lesson books for the Waldorf curriculum, but it is something that we were following with another curriculum that I really liked, and so I included it in here as well. And so this line is actually supposed to go a little bit higher, but you've got your noun, your subject coming first, and then your predicate, and in this case it's just the single verb for this sentence. All right, so here he has another drawing as well as another sentence or several sentences, and here you can see the sentence diagramming model. This line should be a little bit taller, but you can see that this line is shorter, which is correct. And so we were doing some sentence diagramming as well as continuing our lessons in nouns and verbs. And again, this is a continuation, but you can see now that we have added some adjectives in here, and they're in green right here, but later on we choose the color purple instead for our adjectives. He's got his drawing here, and then he's got a number of sentences. So the story might relate to the drawing, and then the grammar will be derived from that story. So there's always a connection to the story that's presented. So it's not just grammar by itself, which can end up being really dry. That's one thing that you're going to notice with the Waldorf curriculum, is that there's an attempt to make most of the lessons as vibrant, as lively, and as heartfelt as possible so that you don't have dry analytical lessons. One thing that I do like about analytical lessons is that I do like them for grammar. So departing from a more analytical approach was a little bit difficult, and that's why you can still see the sentence diagramming in here, because there's something that makes it really easy to lock in your words into a sentence diagram and really have a clear understanding of what those words are. I think by color coding the words, you get that same understanding, but by having the sentence diagram with the nouns and the verbs on the line with the adverbs and the adjectives down below really gives you a sense of what makes up the sentence and what modifies those words in a sentence. Okay, so the remainder of these pages are pretty similar. Again, you've got the nouns and the verbs and a drawing. And here you can see that there's now been the introduction of the adverbs, and we've changed the adjectives to purple. So from this point forward and for the rest of the main lesson books and my children, we just chose purple for our adjectives and orange for our adverbs. We kept the nouns blue, and then I believe eventually we have the articles as purple as well, but we haven't covered that part yet in grammar, so it's just the words or the parts of speech that we've already learned. All right, so it continues with a drawing, and now we have written those sentences in a sentence diagram form. And then we have another drawing, and then on this page we have those different parts of speech with the definitions. All right, at this point, we've transitioned out of using the color pencils to identify the parts of speech, and you can see now we just have some simple sentences. and then some longer narration along with a drawing. All right, so, oh, and then a very long narration at the very back. Okay, so this would be about 3rd grade level. Let me show you the two that we have for spelling. So this one's going to go over spelling and word families and writing. And this writing coordinates with the main lesson of the day, but the main lesson is different than the one that you'll find in 3rd grade because this main lesson book was completed by my son when he was in either 4th or 5th grade. So at that point, we were drawing from a couple of different resources for putting together our grammar and writing and spelling curriculum. And so we did take from this curriculum as well as from other sources. And so you can see that the writing now has a little bit more content, and it's been done by an older student versus this one where you can see that the writing is still big. It still has like a color pencil, like a thick color pencil. And then you can see that the writing itself is quite large, and there isn't quite as much until the end when you can see that the narrations have gotten a little bit longer. But I think that with the writing still being really large, you can tell that this was done by a younger student. And so this was more like 2nd, 3rd grade level. And then this is more like 4th or 5th grade level. So the word families are on one side. And so this will make up this spelling test, or the spelling words. And then the writing is on the other side. And rather than just do one sentence as what you would probably do when you're doing this curriculum, you would just write the one sentence that coordinates with the main lesson. At this point, because my son is older, he's writing a paragraph to basically narrate the main lesson of the day. So rather than me making a sentence for him to just write down, he's actually coming up with all of this content on his own. And then once he's done writing it, he's either looking for words that will match the words in the word families, or he is trying to fit them into his narration, at least one of them into his narration. So he's going to do this for all of the different word families. We use the book called Companions of the Prophet, Volume 1 and 2 for content for our main lesson. And then you can see that it's just going to be the same basic lesson for the entire book. So going over the word families, the anomalies, writing the narration, and then in red, highlighting the words that were from his spelling list. Then after a little while, you can see that some sentence diagramming was introduced here. And then again, you've got your nouns in blue and you have your verbs in red. And then as he progresses and the sentences get longer and more complex, you have your adjectives in purple. And in this case, the articles were in green. And then again, now that we have gone into more grammar concepts, you can see that adverbs have been covered and now they are in orange. So now you can see that this main lesson book covers spelling, word families, narration, and grammar. So you can also see that the sentences here are also getting longer as this unit is progressing. And then we get to the end here, but we actually have another main lesson book that just continues the same work that he had already been doing. So this is the same spelling word lists with the different word families, again, the narration, and then there's sentence diagramming as well with most of these entries. Something to point out with the main lesson book is that this is in the landscape orientation. The main lesson books come in either portrait orientation, and for this particular main lesson block, I think that having it in the landscape works a little bit easier. You can see that they come with just blank pages, and in this case, we bound these on our own. I went over to an office supply store and they just bound some drawing paper, and then I had some construction paper for the front cover, and we just made our own. That way you can choose as many pages as you want, and also you can bind different kinds of paper. This was a thinner paper and this was a drawing paper, and that's just the paper that we happen to have on hand, and I wanted to do that for our main lesson books. Later when I show you the main lesson books that have watercolors in them, it's also a great option to be able to bind your books after you've done your main lesson block, because then you can bind all of your watercolors together and then they're not going to be loose sheets that could get lost. So the other thing is that in general, you'll start with a border around your page, and you'll just be using the crayons that you probably already used in 1st and 2nd grade. And then at this point, he's writing everything with a pencil. If your student isn't quite ready for using a thin pencil, you can use a thick pencil or you can use color pencils. He's doing far more writing here than what you would typically find for the 3rd grade curriculum for spelling and writing and grammar. All right, so it's going to continue with the word families, any anomalies. All of these words will become his spelling words for the week. The spelling tests, you know, sometimes they work, sometimes they didn't work. They've been hit or miss for our family, so I don't have a huge recommendation on whether they are totally necessary or not. But at this point, just having them in the word families is really important so that the student can start to understand which vowel combinations make up which sounds. All right, now you can see towards the end of the book here that there are actually lines that we traced into the main lesson book. At this point, my son was asking for them, but in general, it's not advised that you put the lines in. Sometimes the lettering is a little bit larger for what the lines are going to be, or smaller, but you can see here he was really struggling to keep his lines straight, and so that's why I went ahead and I drew the lines in. Now there is some wisdom in not having the lines for your main lesson book and just having the blank pages. One thing is that it allows younger students who aren't quite ready to write in the small lines that are typical of most main lesson books and notebooks, and so it allows you to write larger letters until you are ready to write those smaller letters. And then something else that's kind of profound in a way is that by learning how to orient your words within the page and in straight lines is a subtle way to help the student also orient himself within the community of the classroom and his family, and then in the larger sense in his larger community. So I really like that even the idea of whether your notebook has lines or not lines has a reason behind it. All right, so let's move on to some of the other main lesson books. All right, the next main lesson book and block I want to show you is The Myths and Culture of a Cotton Sumer. This block was done with mostly watercolors, and they're just beautiful. And then it also comes with the stories that I would have orally told my children, or more likely I would have just read out of the book if I wasn't prepared for the lesson. And then the watercolors are all guided watercolor lessons that complement the lesson. Now, we did ours in the landscape orientation, but a lot of the drawings here are actually in the portrait orientation. So you can choose to do either. So in this case, I've got main lesson books for my older student at the time, my oldest student at the time, who was in either 5th or 6th grade, and then my younger student who was in 3rd grade. And then there's one for me here because this is a guided watercolor lesson, and so I'm going to have the watercolors in here, but I'm not going to have any of the narration. So these are the ones that I did alongside with my students. And I just want to show you the differences in the writing and in the drawing for my different students. So let me go back to this one here. So this is my 5th or 6th grader, and this one is mine. And then I have my 3rd grader here, and he didn't have any narration here, and I'm thinking he didn't have any for any of these, so he just joined us for the watercoloring. So this would be the first example of the different abilities, and you can see that they all look very similar. And then at this point, my son this will be my older son, so I apologize. I've got main lesson books from this grade, but it's from 3 different students over multiple years. So my older student at the time was older than 3rd grade, so his narration is going to be extensive and represent more his grade level, but he still joined us for this main lesson since he didn't do this one when he was in 3rd grade, and I really wanted him to cover these main lesson blocks that he had missed. So in the year that he was in 5th and 6th grade, he did a lot of the main lesson blocks that he would have covered when he was in 3rd and 4th grade, and that was just because I wanted to round out some of those lessons that he didn't get a chance to do. All right, so then the next drawing, you can see my older student, my younger student, and then my example. And you can barely tell the difference between my example and my older student. So they all did really well for this one. One thing I want to point out is that if you wanted to do your written narration, you would need to be mindful of which watercolor you're writing behind. And so you can see here that my son didn't write this directly onto the watercolor paper. We wrote this onto just some really nice high quality drawing paper, and then when we had this all bound, we just put these into the correct place and bound them together. The main lesson book actually suggests that you, instead of watercoloring the entire page, you just watercolor a border and then you can do your narration on the inside, which I think is a fabulous idea. And in other main lesson blocks, we actually did that. So something that you'd want to keep in mind too is that you can see that this blue here bled through from the other side. So you might just do a whole entire blue border, or you might get creative and do partially blue for part of it and then move into some of the other colors for the rest of the border and just leave the middle part blank. And that way you could write in your narration. So this narration is more extensive than you would find for a 3rd grade student. You would probably only have 1 to 3 sentences for a 3rd grade student, and also you would still be writing with a pencil or even a color pencil. And in this case, my son has now graduated to using the fountain pen, and that's why his narration is like that in here. All right, so let's move on to the next entry. Okay, so you can see now that, again, there's little difference in the 3 different watercolors here. It's really hard to tell which one is the teacher's and which ones are the students. Now, this particular watercolor lesson also dealt with colors that were gradually mixing. So you start with the yellow and you have it surrounded by the blue, and then you can kind of see the green emerge. Then you just keep more of a concentrated yellow in the center, and that just coordinates with the main lesson of that day and the story behind the watercolors. Okay, so moving on, we have this entry here, and for this entry we actually redid, or actually we did, in addition to this entry, we did another watercolor of this particular lesson on a really large piece of really high quality watercolor paper. So let me show you what that looks like. So we have this large watercolor paper here. It's by Strathmore, and it's 140-pound paper. You can see that's really thick, and this is perfect for doing your wet on wet watercoloring painting. And the ones that we did for this particular lesson are, I had 3, but I only was able to find 2 of them. This one might have been mine, and then this one was my son's. Then I had another one for my younger son, and there might have even been one for my toddler. It's been several years since we did this main lesson, but I just want to show you that it's the same drawing that we have here, only we did it as a wet on wet watercoloring project, and this was a lesson unto itself. For that watercoloring project, as well as for these, we used our Stockmar watercolors. These are concentrated watercolors that you mix with water. You can just use a small jar, mix it with water, and then it creates these beautiful, vibrant watercolors. And then you can use a sponge to mop up the excess water, since the watercolors are going to be wet on wet. So this paper works great for wet on wet. You just want to get your paper wet, and if there's pools of water, you just want to mop it up with the sponge. And then we have a variety of paintbrushes here. This one would be typically used in kindergarten and first grade, and then as the students get older, the paintbrushes can get smaller, and so these ones would still be done with pretty broad brushes. You don't want a lot of detail at this age. It's still really just general kind of large watercolors, not too detailed yet. All right, so we did do some wet on wet with these watercolor images, but it's a little bit more difficult if you're not using high quality paper. So don't saturate your paper too much if you're not using a high quality paper. Okay, so let's move on. And this would have been original narration. This would probably not have been dictation, although that is an option. The main lesson books will come with dictation examples, some writing examples. You can do some copy work if you'd like, or your student can come up with his or her own narration. Okay, we have a map in here, and you can see that for my younger son, he just did the map and didn't label it. And for my example, I didn't label it either, but for my older student, he did label the map. And then we move on to one of the last watercolors in here. We have this one here, which was a lot more detailed than what we would normally do for a watercolor like this. It's quite difficult to get these kinds of letterings done in watercolor. This is Cuneiform Letters, and it was a little bit challenging to do that with a watercolor, and you can see here that almost all the images just sort of blur. And again, this is far more detailed than you would typically have for this grade, and we didn't do all of the lessons in the main lesson book. We didn't do this one, and there's a couple more at the end that we didn't do either. And so at this point, we were taking our own liberties to do some watercoloring related to the main lesson for the day. So you can see that there are some in here. And something to consider before getting started with your main lesson block is to figure out whether you want your main lesson book to be either in the portrait or the landscape orientation. And if I were to do this one again, I would probably do it in the portrait orientation so that our watercolors match the watercolors, the examples in this book. Because if this is our example, it's a lot easier to do it the way that it's laid out rather than to change the proportions and try to make it in a different orientation. All right, so let's move on to the next main lesson book. All right, so let's move on to the next main lesson block. This is for Hebrew myths and culture. You have prophets and kings and creation and patriarchs. And we did not go through the main lesson book the way it was suggested for this curriculum. We actually used our own resource materials, and we made our own main lesson block that coordinated with this one, but was based on books that were culturally and religiously significant. All right, so let me show you what our main lesson books look like. We have two of them here, and this one was done by my son when he was either in 5th or 6th grade. At the same time, I had a younger student who was in 2nd or 3rd grade, so I'm going to show you both of those main lesson books. So the first one here is, we just did ours on the previous prophets, and the resource materials that we used were a series of books by Ikra Publishing. They are the Prophets of Allah series, and then we also used Ibn Kathir's previous Prophets book. And one of those sets is basically a picture book series that has quite a bit of content, and those ones, they're just great just to sit and read with the kids. And so we drew a lot of our content from that. And then if you want something that's a little bit deeper, a little more extensive, the Ibn Kathir book is a good resource, and then you can create your own main lessons based on those two resource materials. And then this is the illustrations and the narration that my son did. There was a lot of overlap with this particular main lesson block with my two children in different age groups. So I had the chalk drawing on the board, I had the lesson that I delivered to the children, and then my older son gave a more extensive narration, whereas my younger student, depending on the grade level, would have done a more simple drawing and illustration. And then for my youngest student, it would have just simply been the letter of the alphabet. And so a lesson could be really long and extensive for the older student and then really short and brief for the younger student. And then your chalk drawing could have the illustrations necessary for the older student, but have a focus for the younger student. So let me show you how that would actually look, because this is not a great example of that. But let me move on to the story of Prophet Noah. Here we have an illustration of an ark in the water, and we also have the lightning strikes that could potentially look like the letter L. And so this story would work really well when you're introducing the letter L back in first grade, and our first grade curriculum the way we did our main lesson block for the letters of the alphabet was to draw on our Islamic stories rather than the fairy tales that were in the main lesson book for first grade. And so doing the story of Prophet Noah could work for an older student in third, fourth, or fifth grade doing the Hebrew myths, or you could just do it as a separate main lesson block. But then the illustration could work also for a first grader who is still learning his or her letters. And so that's where you can do one main lesson and have it meet multiple students' needs. And so for my older student, again, he would just copy the illustrations that were on the chalkboard, and then he would do his own narration, and he would do like his border. Again, there weren't any lines here. You can see that the borders get a little bit simple as we go along. Most of the illustrations were pretty simple and straightforward. So let me take you to this story on Prophet Musa and the story of the staff turning into the snake. This is another great example for using this one story to introduce the letter S. You can really see the letter S in the snake, and then of course that lesson, that story works well for the first grader as well as the third grader or even beyond. All right, so we got through all of the previous prophets in this main lesson book, and these are the main lesson books that we had bound ourselves, and so you can choose as many pages as you need. So there were less than 30 pages in here for this main lesson book, but if you were using the main lesson books that are pre-made that you can purchase, they're not going to have that many pages in them, and so you would need multiple main lesson books in order to do a larger main lesson block like this. So let me just show you a couple more examples of my younger student. This is a little bit more representative of the second and third grade level, where you have your borders in your crayon still. My son needed a couple of lines, so I just free-handed the lines here for him to write his narration on. This was original narration. If I remember correctly, I could be wrong. It could have also been dictation. And then you can see that his lettering is a lot larger since he was still a little bit younger, and also the illustrations are quite a bit more simple if there are any. All right, so let's move on to the last main lesson block for third grade. I don't have any to show you for Humanity on Earth. We just did projects for this one, but you could do a main lesson book. Then we have time, weight, measure, and money. So this would be the math main lesson block. And again, for this one, you could actually forego doing a main lesson book, and you could just do the projects, or you could just do some of the projects that require drawing on paper and just have them as free sheets rather than doing them in a main lesson book. I want to go ahead and show you the two main lesson books that we have here. This one was done, I believe, by my second son several years ago, and this one was done by my third son a little bit more recently. So let me go through these ones. Again, for this main lesson block, we did some lessons that were culturally and religiously significant. So the first lessons on time have to do with the year and the seasons, and we also included our 5 daily prayers as part of that those lessons, as well as the 12 months, the 12 lunar months according to our religious heritage. We also have some of the other lessons in here that were typical to the main lesson block. The poems that are included are really fantastic and really help you remember how many days are in the month. I still use this one to make sure that I've gotten the days right. All right, so let's continue with some of the other entries. We have the seasons, then we have the 5 daily prayers, which of course is significant for us, and you won't find this lesson in this main lesson block. And I think that's what's really unique about having a main lesson block like this, is that it is primed for you to use it the way that you need in order to represent your culture and background and religious upbringing. And so there may be other timetables that are significant for you that you could include in the main lesson block. So we had our 5 daily prayers, and previously we had the 12 months, and then we went into the seasons in a little bit more detail. There are some poems and some illustrations for the 4 seasons. And then we get into some of the projects that are described in the main lesson book. So it goes into talking about the sundial and the water clock. And those are things that we did a couple of times, actually. All the pages are bordered with just the block crayons. And then I am still writing in some lines here. Once you start this, it's really hard for the kids to do away with the lines. And so even though I would prefer not to have the lines, my kids really prefer to have them in order to get their writing really straight. They like the look of this better. They weren't satisfied when they spent so much time doing their narrations and then their lines were all crooked, or their the shapes of their letters and their words were not proportional. So they really preferred to have the lines. But again, that's a matter of personal preference. At least you know why the lines are not there in the first place. All right, so that was the water clock. I really, really love this lesson on the visual representation of time. I think it's beautiful and it's so unique and artistic. And then you have the typical clock, and this one doesn't move around, but I think in my other son's book we made it movable. Yeah, we got a little bit creative with our scrapbook supplies and made this one movable. So then it goes into time zones, which is actually a little bit advanced in my opinion for the 3rd grade student. And then we have a lesson on the phases of the moon, the lunar cycles, the seasons. And then we get into linear measurement. And then you can see there are just a variety of lessons related to linear measurement. And then finally into money at the end of the main lesson block. All right, so this is part of the main lesson block, but it's not all part of what you would do for math throughout the year. There's still the daily mental math lessons and repetitive lessons that are really short, maybe 5 to 10 minutes, to help strengthen the math facts. So the 4 operations have already previously been introduced, so you want to continue with those. And then the teacher can put up a couple of questions on the chalkboard, and then the student can write them down on a piece of paper or a main lesson book. There aren't a lot of worksheets at this age, and so you can choose to do that if you wish, but you're not going to find that as part of the main lesson block for math. All right, so but just to remind you that that still is something that you will do on a regular basis. It's just that this is the introduction of these concepts that are then going to be reviewed throughout the year. So this is my other son's main lesson book on time and measurement. This is my 3rd son, and you can see that the lessons are pretty similar, but we just took a different approach on how to put them into our main lesson book. Again, there's that visual representation of time, which I really like. This is a new project that we did this year, and it has to do again with our religious background and mapping the 5 daily prayers according to the sun. All right, and so then we get into the lessons on linear measurement, and then the lessons appear to stop at this point. At least they were not entered into the main lesson book anymore. All right, so that is the last main lesson book that I have for you. I have another video that shows some of the other main lesson books that we've completed. You can tap on the screen right now to see that one. And if you want to see some of the other projects and videos in the 3rd grade playlist, you can tap on the screen as well. Don't forget that you can leave questions down in the comment section below. And if you want to see what we're up to on a daily basis, you can find me on Instagram at Pepper and Pine.